Hi, everybody. Today's video is about how to read Legal-Ese, specifically how to read your revocable trust. Unfortunately, as many of you know, lawyers don't necessarily write in plain English, so it can sometimes be difficult, to decipher the documents that you're actually walking out of a lawyer's office with. So this video is just to kind of break down some of the key terms so that when you are reading through your revocable trust, you have an understanding of what the provisions are and about how to go about understanding what it is that you have. So some of the key terms here. The first one is, who is the settlor? And the settlor is the person who created the trust. Some attorneys use the term donor or grantor, but they all serve the same purpose. It's simply the purpose of the person, who created the trust. Next is, who is the trustee? And the trustee is the person in charge of the trust, making sure that the trust provisions are being implemented, make sure the trust assets are being managed appropriately. Again, just the person in charge. Sometimes the trustee is also referred to as a fiduciary, but fiduciary is more of an all-encompassing term that encompasses anybody who's appointed to do a job for you. So an executor is a fiduciary, an agent under a power of attorney is a fiduciary, and a trustee is just another type of a fiduciary. Sometimes it's also possible to have co-trustees of a trust. So let's just say John Smith created the John Smith Revocable Trust for his assets, and he decided sometimes it's John Smith is the trustee of John Smith's trust as well. It's perfectly within the norms to have the settlor and the trustee be the same person for a revocable trust, just because it makes sense for this type of trust in an estate planning context. The reason being is that these types of trusts aren't usually put into place to separate somebody from their assets. It's more typically a probate avoidance tool. So we don't want the person to lose access or control of their assets simply because they just want to avoid probate as well. So it's not uncommon for the settlor and the trustee to be the same person. As I mentioned, however, you can have co-trustees. So maybe John Smith decided him and his wife should both be trustees of the trust because they both have a hand in managing the family finances. So even though John Smith is the settlor, perhaps it's John Smith and Jane Smith together as co-trustees of the trust. The next person that you're going to want to be on the lookout for is the beneficiary, and the beneficiary is the person who's entitled to receive distributions from the trust. And just like I said, the trustee and the settlor can be the same person. The beneficiary can be the same person as well. So John Smith is the settlor of the trust. He created the trust. John Smith could be the trustee of the trust. And John Smith may also be the primary beneficiary of the trust. Again, just because the way these types of trusts are set up, the reasons they're set up, a lot of times that makes sense because, again, we're not trying to separate someone from their assets. So we say you can create a trust, you can be in charge of the trust, and the trust can also be for your benefit. So you can be possibly both the settlor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. Today, we're focusing on revocable trusts, which the word revocable, as the name implies, means that the person who created the trust, the settlor, can always tear up the trust, get rid of it, or keep it in place and just amend the rules from time to time. So I'm focusing on this trust today just because it tends to be more common in terms of trust that we see most frequently. But there's also another type of trust out there called an irrevocable trust, which is the exact opposite. As of a revocable trust, it's a trust that once it's implemented, the rules can never be rewritten. I always tell my clients, irrevocable trusts, you might as well consider them carved in stone, because once you write those rules, you lose the ability to make any further alterations in the future. But again, for the purposes of the presentation today, we're just going to focus on revocable trusts. One of the key provisions you're going to want to pay attention to get all that information of who is the settlor and who is the trustee is usually in the very first section or the very first paragraph of the trust. So I've copied a piece or the section of our revocable trust where we state all that information, and it's right at the top of page 1. It says the name of the trust right at the top. It says John Smith, and we identify where he lives. He's the trustee of the trust. He is the settlor of the trust. So all that information is going to be right up front. Some other key provisions are going to be the lifetime distribution provisions. So because this trust is going to be implemented, or I should say effective, put into existence from the moment it's signed, that means assets can be put in the trust at the same time. So what are the rules for how those assets are to be managed? And a lot of times those rules aren't very restrictive. They say that assets can go out directly to the settlor, to the settlor's spouse, or to the settlor's descendants, so children and grandchildren, pretty much without restriction. That's pretty common. But again, maybe your situation is different. So make sure to take a look at what those quote unquote lifetime distribution provisions are. The next most important section is going to be the distribution provisions upon the death of the settlor. So once the settlor passes away, does the trust terminate maybe and all the assets pass outright to the spouse or pass outright to the children? That's all going to be spelled out in those distribution provisions upon the settlor's death. It's not uncommon too for the trust not to terminate, for the trust to continue on and say that, yes, my spouse or my kids probably are still the beneficiaries of my trust, so I still want them to have the trust assets, but maybe they're going to be retained in trust. So that trust is going to continue on. There's still going to be a trustee in charge of those assets. And a lot of times it's going to take the headings for those types of trusts that continue on are going to be known as maybe a family trust, a marital trust, children's trust. So if you see any of those headings, that's going to be a big indicator to let you know that this trust isn't going to go away just upon the death of the settlor. It's going to continue on. And just like we had instructions for how trust assets are to be managed during the settlor's lifetime, you're going to have a similar set of provisions underneath those headings to say, these are the rules for managing those trust assets while these additional trusts are going to be continuing on after the death of the settlor. And last but not least, the next biggest provision you're going to want to look for is the appointment for successor trustees. So again, in the hypothetical I gave where John Smith is the settlor and John Smith is the trustee, well, at some point during John Smith's lifetime, he may no longer be able to be the trustee because he's become incapacitated in some way. Or if he passes away and there are these ongoing trusts, so there is a marital trust and there is a children's trust or some other continuing trust, John Smith at the time he set up this trust would have appointed somebody to be in charge of those trusts. So take a look at what those successor trustee provisions are going to be. And maybe it says if John Smith can't be the trust anymore, my spouse, Jane Smith, is now the successor trustee. Or maybe it's my children, Sally and Bobby Smith, are now the co-trustees of the trust. But you're always going to want to be mindful of who those successor trustees are, just because, again, there always needs to be a trustee. There always needs to be somebody in charge of the trust. And more likely than not, the settlor has already designated who those people are going to be if it's no longer going to be the settlor as the initial trustee anymore. So that is all for deciphering revocable trusts for this presentation today. If you have any more questions, we do have other videos on our website that go into more detail about what revocable trusts are and maybe the purposes that they serve. So please feel free to check out our other videos.